Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. Now, The Silence of the Lambs was published in 1988, and this is a sequel to Thomas Harris's 1981 crime drama novel, Red Dragon, which was already made into the movie Manhunter in 1986. 2 years before this book was published. Now, the plot of The Silence of the Lambs is it's set sometime after the events of Red Dragon. Now, in this book, you find out that things really didn't end too well for Will Graham, who was the main character of Red Dragon. Like, you find out that he became an alcoholic, and it's kind of implied that his wife may have left him as well. You realize that he was both physically and psychologically fucked up from what happened to him at the end of Red Dragon. I won't give that away for anybody who hasn't read Red Dragon yet, but in this book you could kind of tell that Jack Crawford, who was another character from Red Dragon, you could tell that he does kind of blame himself for what happened to Will, because in Red Dragon, Crawford really was the person who he really did push Will Graham into helping the FBI try to catch this serial killer, which in Red Dragon was Francis Dollarhide. So this book, as I said, is set sometime after the events of Red Dragon. Now, in this book, Jack Crawford ends up sending a young FBI trainee named Clarice Starlin to interview Hannibal Lecter, who of course is locked up in a psychiatric hospital. Now, Lecter was of course a character from Red Dragon. Now, in Red Dragon, Lecter was really only a minor character, but in this book he is one of the main characters. Now, Hannibal Lecter was a psychiatrist who actually murdered and cannibalized his patients, and he was actually captured by Will Graham before the events of the first book, Red Dragon. So, Clarice is sent in to interview Hannibal Lecter, and right off the bat, you can tell that Lecter is very much infatuated with Clarice, and it turns out at the same time this is going on, the FBI are trying to catch a serial killer nicknamed Buffalo Bill, who has been killing young women and actually taking parts of their skin. And it turns out that Lecter might actually have information which might actually help the FBI catch Buffalo Bill, but Starlin is the only person who Lecter is willing to talk to, so Lecter gives Starlin information on Buffalo Bill in exchange for information about her, and he starts, like, asking her questions about her childhood and stuff like that, and throughout the story, Clarice and Lecter develop a very bizarre but very interesting relationship with each other. So, in the story, Buffalo Bill ends up kidnapping a young woman, and this young woman turns out to be the daughter of a senator, so because she's the daughter of a politician, this is getting a lot of media coverage, and now Clarice ends up being the one who has to track down Buffalo Bill and save this young woman. Now, in the book, you eventually find out that this killer is actually a man named Jane Gum, who is a man who actually wants to be a woman, and the reason he's taken parts of his victim's skin is he's actually trying to make a suit out of the skin of women to pursue this fantasy of him becoming a woman. Now, The Silence of the Lambs is an excellent book. It really is. It's a great crime drama novel, it's a great detective detective thriller, and it's a great psychological horror story. And even though this is a sequel to Red Dragon, you could easily read this without having to read the first book. Of course, I still recommend you read the first book, but you could easily read this without having to read the first one. Like, they do mention Will Graham and Francis Dollarhide quite a bit in this book, and they also mention the character of Gareth Jacob Hobbs at one point in this story. Now, Gareth Jacob Hobbs was a serial killer who Will Graham went after before the events of the first book. They mention that character at one point in this book, but even though they do make references to the events of Red Dragon, you could still easily read this without having to read Red Dragon. But yeah, The Silence of the Lambs is a great book, and the book is beautifully written. Like, there's some prose in this book which are almost poetic in a way. Like, this book has some beautiful writing in it. And of course, the characters in this book are great. Like, you have the character of Clarice, who is the main character of the book, and Clarice really is a great protagonist. Like, I loved Clarice in this book. Like, what I really like about Clarice is, even though she is very inexperienced, since she's only a trainee, what I liked about her is she's a very strong character. She's a very strong-willed character, and another thing I liked about her is she really doesn't take too much shit from people either. Like, there's a scene in this book where Clarice has to investigate this warehouse because of something that Lecter told her, and she finds something in this warehouse. I don't want to give away what it is, but what she finds in this warehouse attracts a lot of media attention, and this news crew tries getting in the warehouse, even though she tells them not to, and what she does to one of the cameramen trying to get in is actually really freaking funny. I don't want to give away what it is, but it's actually really badass, actually, what she does. And the book really does get into the psyche of Clarice as well, and she's not a psychologically tortured character like Will Graham was, but it definitely shows in the book that she starts to feel kind of a connection to a lot of Buffalo Bill's victims, so she starts to take almost a personal responsibility in trying to catch Buffalo Bill. And in this book, you of course have the character of Jack Crawford, who really is a great character. Now, in this book, as I said, you could kinda tell that Crawford kinda blames himself for what happened to Will Graham, and in this book, there's also a whole subplot about how Jack Crawford's wife is dying of cancer, and it's a really heartbreaking subplot in the book. Like, there are whole chapters in this book devoted to the relationship between Crawford and his wife, and you see Jack Crawford having to take care of his dying wife, and those parts of the book are actually really heartbreaking, but also really moving as well. And in this book, you of course have the main villain, Jane Gum, aka Buffalo Bill, who is such a creepy and disturbing character, and one of the most disturbing aspects of this character for me is the fact that he refers to these women that he kidnaps not as people, but as it, or things. Like, he doesn't refer to these women as people, he just views them as things. Now, the character of Buffalo Bill was loosely based on people like Ed Gein and Ted Bundy. And in this book, you have the character of Hannibal Lecter, who of course is the character who everybody remembers from this book, and it really is interesting to me how this book focuses so much on Lecter, while in the first book, Lecter really was only a minor character. Thomas Harris even said that when he wrote Red Dragon, he had no intention of ever using the character of Hannibal Lecter again, but when he wrote this book, he made Lecter one of the main characters, and this book really did make the character of Hannibal Lecter into a very iconic character. But yeah, The Silence of the Lambs is a great book. I highly recommend it. I personally recommend reading the first book, Red Dragon, first, but if you don't, you can easily read this without having to read Red Dragon, and it is a very, very good book. Now, this book was made into a movie in 1991 called The Silence of the Lambs, and of course everybody knows about the movie The Silence of the Lambs, and The Silence of the Lambs is a great movie. Like, it's one of those movies that if you're a film fan, you have to see. Even if you're not the biggest fan of, like, thrillers or horror movies, you still kind of have to see Silence of the Lambs if you're a fan of movies in general. Like, The Silence of the Lambs, it's considered to be, like, almost like one of those quintessential films of the 1990s, and it's one of those films that, if you're just a fan of movies in general, it's almost a mandatory film to see. Now, I've always liked Manhunter better than Silence of the Lambs, but I can't deny that Silence of the Lambs is a great movie. Now, after this, Thomas Harris wrote the books Hannibal and Hannibal Rising, both of which were made into movies as well. Now, recently we got the show Hannibal, which is loosely based on the books, but it kind of goes off in wildly different directions, and it does things with the characters from the books that were not done in the books. Like, it really does, it's basically like a what-if kind of story for a lot of the characters from the Hannibal Lecter book series, but I love the show Hannibal. Now, unfortunately, the show was cancelled recently, which really, really sucks, and I still have to see the last few episodes of the show, but it was a really good show, and the show actually seemed to take more inspiration from the books rather than the movies. Like, in the show Hannibal, there was a big subplot about how Jack Crawford's wife was dying from cancer, and that, of course, was taken right from this book. That was actually something that was cut out of the movie version of Silence of the Lambs, but it's something that was taken directly from the book. But yeah, that's my review on The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, and bye.